I mean, can we even call it a brain?
Oh yeah, sure. They have.
Yeah.
The head is full of brain.
Okay.
In fact, it's a very good design because the eye is just on the surface,
Right.
and the rest of the head is brain. And
Okay.
there's all the things that you'd normally find in a cortex are actually there. So, and the more you look at it, the similarity is striking.
Yeah, so that was Professor Srinivasan from the Queensland Brain Institute at the University of Queensland. And we'll get back to him in 1 second. But I'm Ollie, and I just want to lay the foundation of where humans and bees lie in relation to each other. So if we look at our evolutionary family tree, we've got all the animals here. And up here you've got us. We're part of the vertebrates. But then way down here, you've got the bees in the arthropods. So in the grand scheme of things, we don't look that far away, but between us is the sea squirts. So we're not that close. But despite this distance, there are some remarkable similarities between us. And some of those are probably products of parallel evolution, which just means they arose independently. But others are probably indicators of some of the traits held by our last common ancestor. Traits that were lost in other lineages like the sea squirts. And the first of those that I want to touch on is communication. Because humans communicate all the time. I mean, we're communicating right now. You've got movies and songs and everything. But the bees have the waggle dance. Basically, a bee will leave the hive and meander around looking for a flower, using its ultraviolet vision to search for landing strips that the flowers have on their petals. And it will land and find a food source, and then even if it meandered its way to it, it will then make a beeline straight back to the hive. And when it gets to the hive, it will do its waggle dance to indicate the direction of the food source and the length, the distance from the hive to the food source, telling its friends where to go. So the length of this section communicates the distance to the food, and the orientation of the figure 8 communicates the angle of the path relative to the sun. So there's a distance and an angle. And if you're familiar with it from maths or engineering, the bees are basically using a polar coordinate system with the origin being the hive. And it's also amazing to realize that this relies on a shared point of comparison. Because if I was to give you a distance, I would give it in kilometers or miles. And if I was to give you an angle, I'd give it in degrees or radians. So that's relying on the idea that we both understand how far a kilometer is, or how far a mile is, or how much an angle is, and how much a degree is. And so from that, we can kind of talk and have this shared understanding. So the bees must have a shared source of comparison in order to communicate in this way. But what happens then if in the time it takes for a bee to come back and it's wiggling away, something changes about the food source? What if the bee starts to advertise a trap because a predator has moved in to where the flower was?
But thinking of talking about consciousness, for example, and how sentient is a creature like a bee. I don't know if we already talked about it the other day. I don't know if you were there when we were discussing this, but someone did some really lovely work about 7 or 8 years ago now, where he found that if a bee has come back from a food source where it's had a fight with a spider, did we talk about this yesterday?
No.
Oh, we must have been mentioning some of it. So if this bee has come back wounded and has had a fight with a spider there, and it finds another bee dancing to advertise that particular source, so that distance, that direction, this wounded bee will headbutt that dancing bee and stop it from dancing because it's a dangerous food source to advertise, right?
Wow.
Now, is that consciousness? I mean, to say all of that is done without consciousness seems a bit hard to swallow, right?
That's true.
There must be, it cannot all just be a built-in reflex. And it's only that particular location. I mean, so it's not just any random dancing bee being stopped.
It's that
particular location. So it reads the dance and says, aha, I know that location. I've been there before.
It wasn't
I better
good.
stop this.
Well, and so is that just kind of a traumatized bee that will do that forever, or will it know that after some time?
Yeah.
So now the only question is, how in the world did the bee measure its distance and its angle in the first place? And that's our second point of comparison, navigation. And it turns out that both humans and bees have been using the sun as a source of navigation for millennia. But there's just one problem. I mean, we've used it to cross continents and oceans, but what if it's cloudy?
Also, ultraviolet they use to perceive the pattern of polarization in the sky, because if you look at the skylight, it's most strongly polarized in the ultraviolet.
Yep.
And as you may know, I don't know if we talked about that yesterday, but bees use the sun as a compass for navigation, right?
Yeah.
But quite often the sun is hidden behind a cloud, and so you cannot see the sun anymore. But if you can still see a patch of blue sky, you can work out from the pattern of polarization that the sun produces in the sky, where the sun is. So because you've probably done this experiment yourself. If the sun is there, for example, right, and you have your Polaroid sunglasses, and you look 90 degrees away from that direction, and you just rotate your glasses, you see a big difference in brightness as you rotate your Polaroid thing, right? It tells you that patch of the sky is very strongly polarized. And by working out which direction the polarization is, you can work out where the sun is, even if you cannot see the sun yourself. And they use that in lieu of the sun when the sun is hidden behind a cloud. So they need ultraviolet vision for that. So we've all ultraviolet vision for that.
How exactly does the ultraviolet vision allow them to detect that polarization?
It's just it's not the ultraviolet vision itself. It's the fact they've got special polarization sensitive receptors. They've got these receptors which have long, thin kind of tubes,
right.
And they're very strongly selective very strongly sensitive, I should say, to when they're illuminated by light that is polarized this way, and least sensitive when the polarization is orthogonal to those tubes. So is the
bee itself moving to?
Oh no, it's got analyzers in different directions. So it's got multiple analyzers. So it's doing So just like you have three different spectral types of photoreceptors to analyze the color of a flower or something. Yeah. If they're all equally stimulated, it's pretty much white, right?
Yeah.
If the red is the green is very strongly stimulated, it's probably likely to be grass or something. If it blue is very strongly illuminated, it's probably likely to be, I don't know, some blue flower or something like that. Just like that, if you have three orientation analyzers for polarization, which have different preferred orientations, by looking at the ratio of the outputs of those three, you can work out what the plane of polarization, the direction of polarization is.
So it has three for 3 dimensions?
Yeah. So.
Wow. And
two becomes ambiguous, because if you have just two orthogonally oriented ones, you cannot tell the difference between plus 45 and minus 45. But if you have three, that breaks the ambiguity, you see? So you have three, it's like the Mercedes-Benz symbol, 120 degrees apart. And so you've got the three different orientations.
And is that in each individual?
Each ommatidium, yeah. So it's doing the color analysis as well as the polarization analysis in ommatidium for ommatidium. So every pixel, so to speak, of the image has this detailed information.
And then 2 degrees, you said, it covers, like each one of those covers.
Yeah, about a cone of 2 degrees. Yeah. So in a way, it's much better designed than the human eye, because everything gets that one point in space, or that 2 degree patch in space, it's being analyzed uniformly.
Yeah.
Whereas in our system, the red and green and blue photoreceptors are not congruent.
Yeah.
They're looking in slightly different directions. So our system is really a bit messed up compared
to the bee. So we've got a lot to learn, basically. Wow.
Okay, so that's the angle sorted. But how do the bees measure distance? Well, Srini has been one of the researchers who's contributed significant evidence towards the idea that the bees use optical cues from the environment moving around them to determine their distance. So that pattern of motion of the world around you is called optical flow. So, for example, if you see something getting bigger as it comes towards you, well, you think it's coming towards you because it's getting bigger. And if it starts big and gets smaller, you think it's moving away. And we can do a similar thing if you perceive horizontal motion, then you think you're moving. Like if the train next to you starts moving, pulling away from the station, sometimes you feel like you're moving. So that's all called optical flow. And to test it, we put bees inside a tunnel where there was an entry on one end and a food source on the other, and vertical stripes down the sides. And we had them flow from the entry to the food source, come back and do their little waggle dance. Now, from the perspective of the bee, as it flew down the tunnel, the stripes on either side passed behind it. So if we repeat that experiment, but the stripes now also move independently from the food source to the tunnel opening, will the bee think that it's travelling faster or slower? Well, it'll think it's moving faster, because from the bee's perspective, you have the relative motion as well as the new independent motion. But from its point of view, it's all just relative motion, moving in one direction. So if it thinks it's travelled faster, but for the same amount of time, will it report the food to be further away or closer? Further away. And similarly, if you put in horizontal stripes that don't produce any relative motion as you go down the tunnel, the bee can't accurately gauge the distance at all. So the bee is clearly determining distance by the relative motion of the world around it, by the optical flow. Now, Srini went on to say that the mechanism which allows the bees to detect this motion is actually in black and white, because it's very, very old. And because of that, it probably shares a common root with the same mechanism in our own eye, which is also in black and white. So to put that to the test, I want you to watch the next 30 seconds and just be paying attention to whether it seems to be moving to the left or to the right, or to just be stationary. And it's going to be a little bit flashy, so if that's not your jam, just skip the next 30 seconds. And you can blink. You don't have to focus on something and not blink. You can just blink. Just think about which direction it's moving in. Okay, so hopefully you saw it going to the right, it slowed down, stopped for a second, and then moved to the left. And if it did, that's evidence that the mechanism in our eye is black and white. It doesn't care about color, because that video was just these 4 frames repeated over and over again. And the only thing that was changing was the brightness of the blue. So it went from dark blue to light blue. And when the blue and the green are the same value, our eye can't really see the difference. And that's when it seems stationary. We can't really tell if it's moving to the left or to the right. And then that motion to the left or to the right is just determined on whether the blue is darker or lighter than the green. There's no color going on. It's just the relative contrast in brightness. When they're the same value, we can't tell. But I think the most remarkable thing is that bees use this mechanism of optical flow to make a perfect landing. Even on sloped surfaces or on petals that move, they come in and land perfectly using optical flow. And I just want you to think for a second, how could you use optical flow to determine your height above a surface? Is there any way that you could do it? Well, think about when you look out of an aeroplane window down to the ground. The surface of the Earth seems to be moving really slowly. But if you were travelling at the same speed on the ground, the surface around you would be moving so quickly past you. Even in a car moving at a fraction of the speed, it seems and feels faster. So bees simply make sure that as they land, the speed that the surface is moving below them stays constant. So if you're in that plane, when you're up high, the ground looks slow. But as you get closer to it, the plane itself needs to slow down to maintain that same apparent speed. And here, the plane is just the bee, slowing down as it comes into land. And this metaphor provided by Srini is even being researched as a way to land planes in the real world. It would allow them to do it independently of external communication and could be really useful on drones or even stealth aircraft. But utilization and weaponization of optical flow is not uniquely human. And so that's our third point of comparison. And I just want you to watch this little explanation from Srini, and then I'm going to show you something which genuinely blew my mind.
So there's an instinctive reaction to avoid anything that's moving very rapidly. So if you have something like a windmill pattern, something that's black and white sectors, a wheel that's spinning very rapidly, and you can try to convince a bee to come and get some food at the entrance there, but it has a hell of a hard time getting to it because it sees this really huge image motion, and that's almost as though it's repelling it. It's as though it's bumping against an invisible elastic wall and being pushed back by this very high-speed motion. Mind you, there's no window or anything like that. The whole thing is just blocked with
It's just the visual.
It's the visual thing. So just the inherent kind of a tendency to avoid any rapid movement, and that's a good way to protect yourself against collisions, I think, because the moment you get so very close to something, it starts to move very fast.
Okay, now just the other day I was watching David Attenborough, and he was showing these bees that live up and make their hives in the top of the canopy. And one of their main predators are hornets, these big hornets that try and get into the hives. But the bees ward them off by doing this. I could not believe it. And I'm sure Srini knows about this probably, and it may even be where he got the design of the experiment from, but it's still mind-blowing that the bees are leveraging an illusion created by their own optical flow mechanism, which they share or would be extremely similar to the hornets because they're so closely related. And so it's fooled by their pattern, by their illusion. And I'm not saying that the bees have an R&D department that produced this amazing idea. It's just evolution. But I think it's an incredible example of it. And even the coordination and collaboration required to produce that effect is just mind-blowing. But Srini also actually revealed some of the inner social dynamics of the bee colony and showed that it's not actually all one completely cohesive group.
But the more you look at it, the more you feel that these bees really are quite individual. Their learning rates are different.
Right.
Just like kids in a school classroom, right? And you can tell by the way a bee is behaving which bee it is. I mean, you don't even need to color code them quite often.
Wow.
They have very individualist, very characteristic behavior patterns, and the more I study them, the more I feel I don't think you can treat them as an entire colony with kind of a whole bunch of anonymous individuals. They really are pretty individually kind of,
Where do you think that comes from? In the sense that genetically there'd be...
Okay, that's interesting. As you probably know, it's all the worker bees, the ones that go out foraging, are females, right? The queen bee, the one who lays all the eggs, she goes out just once in her life, or maybe twice, and does this thing called a nuptial flight, where she mates with several drones, one after the other. And they all die, by the way, as you've probably heard.
And then
the act of mating.
Does she even keep that
that she can maintain that whole collection of sperm, and it's a cocktail of sperm in her sperm sac
Mm-hmm.
for the rest of her life.
That's
So maybe for 4 or 5 years ahead.
Wow.
And she preserves that sperm. By the way, it's a great. People are looking at this for sperm banks, human sperm banks. It's not being frozen. It's being maintained at the body temperature of 36 or 37 degrees of the bee, and yet nothing goes wrong. But what's interesting is that the sperm has come from several different fathers, right? And so, okay, now if she lays an egg, she can choose to either fertilize the egg or not fertilize it. If she fertilizes the egg, then it grows into a worker bee.
Right.
And depending on which sperm fertilized it, that decides who the father was, right?
Yeah.
So what you seem to find is that you have these full sisters, which all come from the same father, and then you have within the same hive bees that are half sisters, because they have the same mother, but they come from different fathers. And what you find is that there's kinship there too. So the ones that come from the same father, they hang out together, and they look out for each other, apparently. Now, how do they recognize each other? We don't know. It could be olfactory cues, it could be some kind of smell cues, because, the different genetic background. But anyway, they hang out together, and there's a bit of kinship happening even at that level. It could still be instinctive.
But even
there.
so, what is causing that instinct?
Yeah, but it's the same with human beings, right? I mean, family tends to look after itself,
But all of this isn't to just say that we should really care about bees because they're so similar to us, but rather that I just don't think we're that different from the world around us that we often like to imagine we are. And you probably know that there's a global decline in insects worldwide at the moment. And so just plant some flowers. Look out especially for the native bees wherever you are, and just keep an eye out for them, because now we know that they might just be keeping an eye out for us. Ugh. So this is the lavender next to my house, which the bees have always loved. Yeah, so pretty cool animals. But I just wanted to say a massive thank you to Professor Srinivasan for sharing his expertise and just being so amazingly gracious. So I really encourage you to check out his work down below. I'll leave some links, and if you're interested in flowers and plant mimicry, then I've got a video you can check out, and if you just want to get the next thing, then feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you there. So thanks heaps. Bye. A bee just landed on my head.